First things first, how are you?
Good, thank you. How are you?
I'm not too bad at all, not too bad at all. So before we get into what you and what the band has been up to lately, one thing I find interesting, since the album has been out for a little bit and some of the songs are even quite have been written quite a while ago, have they already kind of changed or evolved in your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think like anytime you get into rehearsing or starting to think about live, they always kind of take on a new life. The interesting thing about this record was that it was the first time we were able to road test some of the songs already before the record was out. So it's interesting to see. And then we kind of didn't listen to the record at all when we were doing that. We just kind of took
Okay.
these songs into the studio and kind of worked on them as live arrangements. And now the record is out and people are living with them. And we've already changed some of the arrangements on some of those songs that we were playing out live. So I'm curious to see when we get into rehearsing for the record, um, you know, for the tour that we're doing this summer and then obviously in the fall in November, um, how those songs that we haven't played live yet evolve, because that's always interesting and that's just something that just happens naturally when you go take some of the songs that you work on in the studio and start playing them live. They just take on a new life anyway. So I'm
When
curious
you
to see what happens.
when you go into the studio, then is the live show in the back of your mind? Are you aware of that, or is that something that's separate and that comes later?
I think it's twofold. I mean, I think sometimes what happens is you're in the studio and you're like, oh, I can hear what this is going to do or what's going to happen live. But it's not until you start really playing it um, together in a room of people that it starts evolving into something that you didn't expect. And sometimes it's something you expect is going to happen, and sometimes it's something that is just completely unexpected that takes the song into a new space. So it all just depends. But I know there's always moments in the studio where you're like, oh wow, this is going to be great live. This is going to be
Mm.
great live. You always say that, or at least I sometimes I think, and sometimes you think, oh, this is going to be great live, and then you get to rehearsing and you're like, wow, this is impossible to play live. We need to figure something else out and take this into a new direction.
Yeah, because that's what I'm imagining. Sometimes that translation from a studio sound to what is possible on a live stage can be quite tricky. And I think even though I don't think you over rely on technology, that there is this atmosphere that is created. So how difficult is that to replicate in a live setting?
I think we've just gotten better and better at it, and we've kind of thought about the record and the live show as two different things. And I think when you do that, you start opening up possibilities that probably that you didn't think you could do, you know. And I think that that's what I am really interested and curious about is taking what you do in the studio and then pushing it live. And those things can be different, you know. They don't
Yeah.
have to be mutually exclusive, and when you're in the studio, obviously you have like the power of technology at your fingertips. But the beauty of something live is that it's a moment and it's kind of fleeting, and like a wrong note doesn't mean anything, and you can adjust live, and sometimes something breaks live and you have to kind of come up with a new way, a new solution on the spot. And also, I mean, there's something really interesting about being okay with it being different live and
Mm.
feeling, I like that feeling where something is uncomfortable in the live setting. I think that's what kind of makes everyone better musicians, to be able to react to each other in real time. I think that's
Yeah.
the beauty of playing live.
I think what you just said now, a wrong no note doesn't mean anything. I really like that. What is you kind of alluded to it already, but what is the magic in playing music live to people and kind of sh building that community and sharing that timeless moment in time?
I mean, yeah, for me, that's the culmination of making records. And there's this thing that happens live is that there's a direct connection of you to the fan, and or you to the community, or you to somebody that's never heard you before. I mean,
Sure.
that's kind of my favorite thing is someone that coming in because their friend told them that they should check this band out, and they're like, yeah, well, yeah, whatever. And then they come in, and that moment live when you're actually connecting, there's so many kind of emotions that go into the way the show is portrayed or the way the show is played or the way the show is feeling at a certain second, and a lot of it is just completely out of the hands of us, but what we're trying to do is channel it and trying to, for me it's always about like getting to the heart of the song when I'm kind of singing live, and I take more chances probably, and I kind of react to what's going on in the room, and it's a real thing. I mean, you even if the crowd is, it's just if they're there, there's just this weird connection that happens between the band and the crowd, and it is very true that you can feel the energy, that there's just an energy in the room, and in the studio you're kind of looking for that energy. You're kind of like
Mm,
waiting for the to happen through the speakers and go like, oh, there's an energy, and you lean in and you want to work on it, and that's because it's sounding a certain way, or that part that you were struggling with is finally feeling a certain way. But live, it's got that's never crossing your mind. It's always
sure.
just like trying to like dig deeper into the heart of the feeling of the night or the moment, and so I think that's kind of the main difference.
And what I find interesting then, because I read an interview where you kind of talked about, well, in essence, how fragmented today's audience is in terms of our attention span, and there's just, I mean, I work as a music journalist, just the sheer amount of albums that come out every week, and everybody's vying for attention in a way. Um, how have you found peace in what you do and in navigating kind of the modern musical landscape?
It's definitely difficult and it changes day to day. But I think I always come back to the same thing is that, really lucky to just be able to create music with um people that I love and be proud of that. And I mean, more and more, I've become obsessed with the idea that these things live forever. These you make these and they'll find people or they won't, but you have to be okay with the idea that you made this and that at a certain time in your life you put everything you had into it, and you have to be okay with kind of letting that moment go when it's released into the world. And so I've kind of very difficult to do, but I've tried over the last, I mean, even, since the record's been released a month ago or whatever, maybe longer, just be at peace with that idea that it'll find people and that it will also live forever. And it's going to always be part of you and the moment and the band and the history of the band. And in reality, that's actually really beautiful.
Yeah, and I think I have a bunch of friends who collect LPs, and kind of them sifting through uh, bu buckets and buckets full of LPs trying to find that hidden gem, and that's kind of the music is out there, and there's always somebody who will find it at some point. So that's a very interesting thought.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And to be part of that, to be part of that artistic expression is the reason we do it. And so, yeah, I love that idea. Is like one day someone will find a Low Moon record dusty in a bin, and they might pick it up and be like, "Oh wow, I'll put this on," and then they might like it. It could be 50 years from now.
Right.
And so, if I kind of think about it in that way, which I've been doing a lot more recently, and just going because it's impossible to predict what happens when you put a song or a record out.
Sure.
And especially these days, as you know, it's like how many records are coming out every Friday, how many songs are coming out every Friday. So there's no use trying to fight against that.
Just a quick question in between then, and if you don't want to get into it, that's fine. But is it easier that process when you're not with a major label and there's not that kind of thing hanging over you?
Yes and no, to be completely
Okay,
honest. The process of making a record, I mean, to be fair, the two records we made on a major, they they didn't really like they weren't really over our shoulder telling us exact or the first record, and then obviously we started the second record while we were on a major, but they weren't really like they gave us artistic freedom, and they definitely weren't forcing us into something that I think we weren't comfortable doing. That we got signed on Loveless, which was a 7-minute track. And so there was kind of, and it was, but it was before data and before all of this, you know, these points of reference for like, what are you doing? And you're judged on this because I can see how many people are listening at this very moment, and I can tell how many, and you just have to kind of forget about all that.
Mm,
But and when you're making and putting out records on your own, there's there's obviously there's hurdles with both. But
sure.
I think I've come to realize that it doesn't matter. Really, it's just about the expression of the art, and being able to make records at all. I'm just really happy to be able to do that at all. So I think both ways are okay, as long as the art is not. I think if the art is compromised, then that's where it becomes really difficult. And luckily for us, I mean, we haven't really had that.
Right. Well, that's very good to hear. And what I find interesting, you mentioned kind of the art of expression, or expressing art, and basically, I was reading about the story how you kind of discovered to express yourself through art, and it's such an interesting story, and I think it is relevant for this album. So going back to that little chapel in Connecticut, when did you feel that kind of in 2020 going back there was necessary in a way?
When I was, to be honest, when I was just completely lost artistically because I didn't, we weren't playing shows. We were trying to finish our second record. There was just a moment where I was like, why am I doing this? And it became the battle to get something done, or the battle to like write the next song, and I was just confused and kind of oddly felt disconnected to the art. And so, when you're in high school, or when you're discovering something for the first time, there's a childlike energy that happens,
Sure.
and you're just basically just, this is what I do. And the judgment and the everything goes out the window, because you're just expressing yourself in this way that's completely kind of also in some ways very uncomfortable, but also very comfortable, because you're just, this is the way I'm expressing myself. And for me, it was in the first time I wrote a song, and I discovered that I loved singing, and I loved playing the guitar, and I loved expressing myself through lyric and trying to find the right words. But at the moment, I wasn't thinking like, oh, this is going to be my career. And so I think just coming to that realization and going, I think this is going to make me feel better if I go back and reconnect with the thing that first made me fall in love with this thing that I've been doing, that is really, really difficult sometimes. And some days I don't understand even why I'm doing it. And it kind of, it worked to connect back to the spirit of why I started expressing myself in the first place. So in theory, it was like, I guess, a way to put myself back into the position of like, do you actually want to do this?
Mm.
And does it make you feel better to do this? And both of those questions were very, very quickly answered when I went back there. So I'm happy I did.
During kind of the COVID period, I moved back to my hometown, and now my view on my hometown is a little bit different now that I'm older, now that I have different life experience. What did you encounter when you went back, and what kind of world did you rediscover?
Yeah, I mean, the weirdly, it felt very similar. Like this, like one of the things I keep thinking about is that the actual building, the chapel's been there for, I mean, so many years, and it hasn't changed at all. And I think that that's part of it, was that I was stepping back into a place that was seemingly no difference than the first time I stepped in there in 2000,
Mm,
which was so 20 something years ago. So I think that there was a beauty about that, and there was a familiarity about the actual place had not changed. And the campus and everything around it'll never change. It's like New England is kind of stuck in time, in a really beautiful way. And so I do think that played a part of it, is like it was very familiar to me. It was very comfortable, and also extremely nostalgic. And I do think during the pandemic, everyone was kind of nostalgic. Like you said, like you
sure.
go back home. there's a nostalgia about that.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, I mean, for me, it's interesting. I recognize all the buildings and everything's the same. Just what's in it is a little bit different, and the kind of
Yeah,
how the people operate and stuff. So,
where
but
are you?
oh, in the east of the Netherlands, I'm in a little small town.
Amazing.
It's it is kind of getting used to after living in Amsterdam for a long time, but still. Um, with that kind of, you mentioned kind of that there is a sense of nostalgia in there, and one of the to me the standout one of the standout tracks is Borrowed Hills, and I believe that was also kind of the catalyst for the album, if I'm not mistaken.
It was. Definitely was. Yeah, the first song we wrote for the album.
What was the spark, or what ignited that song, and then kind of ignited then what was to come next?
The spark really happened when I went to the chapel and I had my guitar in this kind of odd tuning, and I was just playing this kind of droney thing and singing "It's anybody's guess what will happen." And the way that sounded in that chapel with, and I was thinking, I think I said, on the borrowed hills of youth, I think I said that in the chapel, and I was like, wow, that's interesting. This idea of borrowed hills, because this place that I had kind of found myself in, and then I left, and I kind of never
Mm,
thought about it again for 20 something years. But the amount of growth that happened in that place on those borrowed hills is instrumental to the person I am now. And so I
sure.
think that just kept coming back to me, and that line "borrowed hills" is really, I thought it was poignant, and I'd never heard it in that kind of way. So I think it was just, and then listening to the demo or the voice memo that I had a couple weeks after I'd left the chapel, and I sent it around to the band. And I think this happens all the time. It's like sometimes I'll send something to the guys and they'll be like, whatever. But this was something that they thought I was doing something different, and the
Mm,
melody was different. The kind of arrangement didn't really come to life until we took it in the studio, and it was basically two different songs that I had written in the chapel, and then we merged them into one. Sam really was like, "This should be one song, and why don't you take this from this song and put this here?" And then we had this great drum groove that Sterling was playing because the mics were kind of in an odd position over this kind of makeshift drum kit. It all kind of started happening organically as a band. Um, but the initial spark happened in that chapel, and I think you could hear that all the way through. And then we went back to the chapel and kind of recorded in there, and I did some vocals in there when it was kind
mm.
of more of a figured out idea. So I love that lineage of that song because it really has like started with this very molecular idea of me in the chapel, and then ended up with the band. You could feel the band, and it's kind of this epic, beautiful thing. And then we took it back to the chapel, and like it's one big thing of the band. So I think it's just kind of a beautiful moment in the band's kind of, I don't know, in our timeline.
Sure. And I wrote another line down from that song as well. Everybody wants to imagine they can fly once in their lifetime. Now, uh, Thunder Road is my favorite Bruce Springsteen song, and the kind of that idea of leaving uh, where you're from in search of something better. Where did that sentiment come from?
Like a lot of things that happen with my songwriting lyrically, it just, that's a line that just came out. And then I thought it was interesting. What I'll do is I'll just ramble on for ages, and then I'll write down lines that kind of came out of my subconscious, and I thought, well, that's really interesting, and that's true, especially as a kid, right? You're and it's this idea that there's something bigger, there's somewhere to
Mm.
go. you know, I need to get out of this town. Obviously the Thunder Road, there's a little bit of a Thunder Road reference there. It's like there's something more to what I'm doing to my life. And so let's go back to the chapel. Um, and and I think that that's across this entire record, really.
And now, having lived in LA for quite a bit, then was that sentiment true in a sense for you? And then obviously you are, as you mentioned, in the band that does that has the chance to make music and stuff. So have you? This is gonna sound ridiculous, but have you kind of found the promised land?
Haven't found the promised land. No, I think I think that's the whole ethos of why we make music is because the promised land is this thing that is kind of always out of touch. And if I feel like with me, especially like if I've ever thought I found the promised land, my music will become horrendous because there's no
Mm.
more yearning or search. There's no more beauty. There's so I think we kind of make records to try to find that moment.
Well,
And I think it also changes. I think it
of
changes.
course, especially as we grow older, our views of the world and values and all that shifts depending on our
100%.
experience. And another song I wanted to highlight was "Honest," because I read that this was a song that was, at least the bones for it were written at least 5 years ago, and it took a long time to find the right version. And what I find interesting then is that the version that you ended up with is a very delicate, kind of sparse version. So how did it end up, kind of after all that thought, ended it up in a kind of this delicate piece?
Yeah, I mean, the first version of it, the demo was like this kind of Phil Collins synthy thing that I never thought was right, but I loved the sentiment of the song and I loved the melody. And I wrote the song, yeah, around 2018 in
Mm.
London, uh, and showed it to the band, and they always loved the song. And we tried to record it for the second record and a couple times for the second record, like different versions. Um, and we went up to the studio in Stinson Beach when we started working on the third record. And the studio was kind of this place called Panoramic, and it looks over Pacific Ocean and the kind of north of San Francisco. It has this beautiful window, and in the main room, you can look at the ocean. And every time we'd have a break, and we were all living together. It was this residential studio, but every time we took a break in the studio, I would go over near the piano and just mess around. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, I just stumbled upon playing the motif of the piano differently than I'd ever played it. And it was this idea that our co-producer on the record, Mike Davis, someone who we've known for a really long time and worked on the first record with us. I never showed him any version of the song, but I knew I wanted it on the record. And the reason I did that was because the band and I had been so sick of working on the song that we
Mm.
figured if we didn't show Mike and it came up at a moment in time and he reacted to it, we might find some legs to kind of work on it. And so I was just playing this motif, and then I was like, oh wow, this would work for Honest. And I started singing it, and immediately his ears perked up. And he had mics on the piano and the vocal and a vocal mic, just was already up there from recording something else. And he pressed play on it. And I recorded it like 15 times. I just got into a rhythm of kind of figuring out the chords and figuring out, and we just recorded it. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, it just felt like the most honest, purest version of that song. And the band was kind of, they were adamant. They were like, "That's it. It's done. It's finished." And then we took a string arrangement from a previous version and gave that to Mike, our producer, and he kind of chopped it up. And I played it 10 times, recorded it, and then I asked Mike. I told him I never wanted to hear it again until the end of the record, and he played it for us, and he was like, "All right, this is it," and it was done. I mean, the band that night, I think we kind of shut the lights down in the studio, and the band all did their thing. They all got in separate instruments and droned and made some atmospheres, and then we kind of like put it to bed, and then Mike worked on it for a bit, and just felt like that was the version.
Mm.
And I always knew it could really be the last song on the album. I just if it was going to be right, it would be the last song on the album. So it just
Well,
kind of presented it.
yeah, and I love the fact that when the band heard it, that none of them went, "Oh, I hear my bass coming in here" or something like that. That they could leave it. I think that says a lot about the band.
It does, and I think with that song in particular, we had tried so many different versions that we had to succumb to the fact that like we didn't need to fit everything in.
Mm.
And it's the thing about this thing I'm becoming more obsessed with now is just space and there's kind of nothing better than silence. So sometimes it's okay to be quiet and let the music tell you what it should be doing. And that's something I'm becoming more and more obsessed with as we do this. I mean, as You might not be able to hear it on our records now because they're full and they're dense, but it would be beautiful to not have that be the case all the time. So I think that was a good lesson for us on Honest for sure.
Yeah, fair enough. I just remembered what it was that I wanted to ask you before, which is kind of about this yearning, this drive, or this. I don't know if quest is, is the right word, but can you explain this a little bit, or maybe I don't know if it's explainable, but how do you see that? Is that kind of the search for the perfect song? Is that the search for the perfect
I think
how would
it's
you say? Go ahead.
I think it's always like the search for some kind of feeling emotionally that kind of moves me or moves the band or moves any of us. And sometimes that's yearning, sometimes that's angst, sometimes that's nostalgia, sometimes that's, something super melancholy. Sometimes it's just succumbing to whatever the music is supposed to be telling you what to do. And sometimes it's like a line, sometimes it's like you read, for me, a lot of it comes from, if I'm reading something and the line makes me stop.
Mm,
I mean, that it can be as beautiful as that. It can be as simple as that. Truly. I mean, truly it can be that easy. It's like this line made me stop what I was doing, and it's making me want to do this with this song. Or so I think it's, but I think if the search or the yeah, I think if the search ends, then there's no reason to really make music anymore. So
sure.
um for me, at least, for me, I mean, that's what kind of drives it.
This is kind of a mean question then, but if we take this new album, is there one line that you're particularly happy with that you came up with?
I think the first line of the record, when you're looking for the truth on the borrowed hills of youth, I think that line, I'm like, I think that's particularly poignant as the first line of an entire record when the rest of the record kind of points back to it all the time.
Mm,
So I'm proud that opens the entire record. I think it's something that will grab you, and I was proud of it when I wrote it. So I'm still proud of it. So that's a big
fair.
sign. It's been months long and longer, and I'm like, oh, I still think that's pretty good.
Yeah, that probably means it's a good line. So I have one last question. You mentioned kind of want to write perhaps a little bit more sparsely, give the music a little bit more space to breathe. How have you written? I think you always write, but have you already written for something that will come next?
Yeah, I think there's a few things that are coming out of the writing that we've been doing recently. So yeah, we're trying to work on music this summer. And I think that's where we start is never where we end up. But if I say
Sure.
that, I would like to kind of keep it more sparse and just kind of play with space. And that's just kind of what's taking up the most space. Is it the vocal here? Is it the guitar here? And just hone in on these things that I think are essential to what the band does. And I think that's also going to keep it interesting for us. Restraint, I think, is something that we're going to work on for the next record for sure.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what you come up with. Matt, may I thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me.
Thank you. Thank you so much.